to the next session, Ramachandra Rao's session, Refractive Surgery, Goal Emetropia. I would now like to invite our esteemed chairs. I welcome Chairperson Dr. Rohit Shetty, Co-Chairperson Dr. Rupal Shah, and Moderator Dr. Rishi Swaroop. I would now hand over to Dr. Swaroop to please proceed. Over to you, Dr. Swaroop.
Thank you, Diksha. I welcome all of you to this very interesting evening refractive symposium. And we have a galaxy of stars who are leaders in refractive surgery in India. I'd like to welcome Dr. Rohit Shetty. Has he joined us? Yes, he's great. He's here. That's great. Dr. Rupal Shah, Dr. Gaurav Luthra, and Dr. Jagdish Reddy. They're all fabulous speakers, and in their own right, they are leaders in refractive surgery. Dr. Rohit Shetty and Dr. Rupal Shah will be chairing the session, and both of them need no introduction. Dr. Rupal is one of the senior most refractive surgeons in the country. In fact, she's a teacher of teachers, I would say. She's taught refractive surgery to my dad also, and I've also learned a lot of things from her, especially after we've got SMILE. Dr. Rohit Shetty is a clinician and academician par excellence, I would say. Somebody I really look up to. He's really taken Nara Nethralaya to fabulous new heights, which nobody would have imagined. It's right up there with the top institutions in the world, and he's put India on the map. And kudos to him for doing such a fabulous job. Single-minded focus on certain disease entities. Dr. Gaurav Luthra, again, a very, very dear friend, and he looks very young, but he's actually not that young. He's, again, a very accomplished refractive surgeon and has some really wise pearls to give and lots to learn from him, which he'll say very casually, but everything he says carries a lot of value. Thank you, Gaurav, for joining me and immediately saying yes. And finally, Jagdish Reddy, he's one of the young guns. He's the head of cataract and refractive services at LV Prasad, and dynamic young friend of mine who's somebody I often even send patients to when I have something which I can't handle at my level. So I welcome all of you to this symposium, and I request the first speaker, Dr. Rupal Shah, to give her talk, which is on a very interesting topic. I think a right topic as the first one, selecting the right refractive procedure for every patient. And I think I don't think there's any better person in this group who can speak on this topic. Over to you, Dr. Rupal.
Thanks, Rishi. And thank you, TOS, for giving me this opportunity. I would like to share my screen. Is my slide visible?
Yes, ma'am. We can see your screen.
And you can also hear me, right?
Yes.
So I'm very happy to be the opening batsman. Refractive surgery is very close to my heart, and I'm actually very happy, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity here. I'm going to be talking about refractive procedures and to match the correct refractive procedure to the patient. This is very important in a refractive surgery setup. So there is no one cap which fits all. Refractive surgery is all about choosing the correct expectation, giving the correct expectation, giving the correct outcome of their expectations, and to use the modality which would work the best for that particular outcome. And therefore, we should explore all the choices that we have in refractive surgery and not limit ourselves only to a particular procedure, because that's what your laser does. So I'm just going to be summarizing what all are possible, what is the current trend, and how we can exploit the many facets that are available to us in order to give the most satisfactory outcome to our patients. So if you talk about refractive surgery today, it's not limited only to the cornea. There are also some intraocular procedures which aid us where the cornea cannot be operated upon. So if I have to enumerate the corneal procedure, that can be excimer laser base, which can be the surface ablation. LASIK. It can be femtosecond laser base along with excimer laser, which would be femto-LASIK. All these LASIK procedures and surface ablation procedure can be done in wavefront optimized form, wavefront customized form, and also topographically guided. And then there is the SMILE procedure, which is now available to us since almost a decade now. And if cornea is not good enough to be worked upon or is not going to give us the satisfactory outcome, SMILE works for intraocular procedures like ICL and lens exchange also can be added to your armamentarium. So we start with the surface ablation. Surface ablation means you remove the epithelium and go through the Bowman's membrane with your excimer laser into the anterior stroma in order to achieve your refractive correction. This should be taken up if you have errors which are less than -6 diopters. And on the hyperopic side, I would like to limit on the surface to about +2 diopters, unless you're going to also combine it with a C3R procedure, where you would then be able to get a more stable outcome. Otherwise, to do a very high hyperopia with surface ablation would mean that you would have regression and haze. It's particularly useful when there is basement membrane dystrophy, which is accompanied with refractive error, or if there are some superficial corneal opacities, where the cornea is thin and you don't want to create any flap or a cap, then surface ablation definitely plays a major role. And when patient does not want any evidence of any refractive procedure having been done, again, a surface ablative procedure is going to be useful. There are many ways to do surface ablation, and the ways differ in terms of how you remove the epithelium. Here I'm showing you the most basic way of using an instrument which is very blunt. It can be in the form of a hockey stick knife, it can be a Tux knife, it can be anything that works best in your hand. But at the end, you need a surface which is so smooth with no tears on the Bowman's membrane. And once you have a smooth surface, you can have the excimer laser run on it. It's very easy to achieve this with something which is known as an Emoly's brush, or you could use the laser itself, and that's known as the transepithelial PRK. You could use a microkeratome-like device, which has a very blunt blade attached to it, and it would be known as epi-LASIK. Or if you're not very familiar, you can also use assistance of alcohol, which would cause the epithelium to become very loose, and then it's very easy to remove. In all these cases, we are removing the epithelium and not preserving them. And this is the surface ablation procedure can also be aided by mitomycin C if you're going to be treating very high myopia, and that would also prevent the haze formation. The downside is that there could be pain for a couple of days after the procedure and a slower visual recovery. Pain can very well be handled now with NSAID or AccuWell soaked bandage contact lenses, as Dr. Rohit had pointed out very nicely. You can put a bandage contact lens so that there is less pain. You could even use painkillers systemically, and use of very chilled BSS at the end of the procedure again helps to reduce the pain. The slower visual recovery is as compared to LASIK or SMILE, and that you cannot help, but it still means that you're doing a very safe procedure, leaving the cornea absolutely safe. So surface ablation today definitely has a role to play. So we come to LASIK, which is like a jet. So if you're comparing PRK to a train journey, this is like a plane journey. You reach much faster to the same destination with much less effort, but and with much less use of steroids. Today, if you ask me, after using femtosecond laser for creating a flap for almost more than 13 years now, I would say that wherever possible, and if it is affordable to the patient, I would prefer to use the femtosecond laser to create a flap, simply because of its predictability, safety, and stability. So the flap is going to be a much better defined. You would have a predictable approach to the stromal bed. You can make as big a flap as possible, and it would mean that you are going to be able to do the procedure at that moment itself, and not going to have this ifs of whether the flap doesn't get made properly, then you would have to postpone the case. It gives very quick visual recovery, induces minimal pain. But since you are creating a flap, either with a microkeratome or with a femtosecond laser, you are going to have the issue of dry eyes and an occasional keratectasia if your flap has become too thick or if you have not been able to leave behind enough on the stromal bed. You would also find that you can actually treat errors up to about 10 diopters, at least in our country. We do need to go a little higher on these ranges as compared to the Western world, because we are not going to be able to, not all our patients can afford an ICL. Not all our patients can also go for any premium lens-based methods. And if you use a microkeratome LASIK, it can be given and offered to a patient at a much cheaper rate, as well as a more affordable way of doing things, even for yourself. So microkeratome LASIK, again, still has a very great role to play, especially in our country. If you can afford a femtosecond laser, yes, that's the way to go to create a flap. But femtosecond laser would have limitation in the sense that if there is a very dense corneal opacity, which is anterior, and if your flap is going to be within that corneal opacity, the femtosecond shots may not be able to reach the stromal bed at which you want the flap to be created. So that's going to be one limitation to the use of femtosecond laser. Apart from that, femtosecond lasers probably would score more in terms of safety in a microkeratome as compared to a microkeratome laser. When you're talking about LASIK, there are going to be different options that are available to you. You can have a wavefront optimized treatment where you're trying to retain the prolicity of the cornea by inducing the minimum higher order spherical aberration, which can occur because of the older pattern of the way excimer lasers were working. Today, a wavefront optimized treatment is a must for every virgin eye, because you should try to retain the prolicity of the cornea in order to give a good quality vision to that patient. A true wavefront guided treatment is used only when there are significant higher order aberrations which are affecting the quality and the quantity of vision, and that forms hardly 1 or 2% of your entire refractive surgery limit. But it's generally useful when mesopic pupil size is more than 7 millimeters. And then you also have the option of a true topographically guided ablations. Now, when you are using guided ablations, initially, so we've been using it since almost 13, 14 years now. So initially we used it only for repair of failed primary surgery. So if there were decentered ablation, if there was non-homogeneous ablative zone, if there were irregular ablation, then this came as a repair tool. It was also useful for iatrogenic or naturally irregular corneal astigmatism. It's also combined with C3R procedures for having a more smooth final outcome. So you can actually add this topo linking to your C3R procedure in order to have a better quality of vision post C3R. And it is also now available to be used in treatment of primary cases, especially when you have a significant topographic abnormality in the cornea. And it can be combined, as one of the examples is to use the Contura in order to get a better outcome. And then the white ball is mine. It uses only the femtosecond laser to perform the entire refractive procedure. It's more useful when refractive error is less than 10 diopters in spherical side and up to 5 diopters of cylinder. Cannot be used for hyperopia. You cannot use it for a true customized treatment, but it gives you an optimized treatment always. And it's very useful when patients do not want a flap, and especially when patients are for contact sports. And it promises better biomechanical strength and less dry eyes as compared to LASIK. It's a procedure which is very dear to me because I had been able to study this in its infancy, and it definitely has its own advantages. So I'm not going to be touching upon the lens-based methods because that can be also a great topic in itself. But having said that, I would say that ICL enlarges the gamut in which you can correct refractive errors, and then clear lens exchange will be useful for people who are in the presbyopic age group, where you could use different types of IOLs available to you. I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a lovely talk encompassing the entire gamut of refractive surgery and gave us an insight of how to select our patients and give them the right option for the right time. I'll move on. Any questions or any comments from the other panelists here? Gaurav, any comments?
I think a very balanced talk by Dr. Rupal, because it always is so important to have, you should not be fixated on one procedure for every patient, and I think that's what makes all the difference. A refractive surgeon should be able to best decide that what works best in their hands. They can be surgeon preferences, but I think the patient interest comes first, and based on what a patient deserves, patient should get that. And once in a while, if you can't do that thing yourself, you should not hesitate to refer it out to somebody who can do a procedure which you are not offering.
Totally
maybe.
agree with you, Gaurav. Totally agree with you.
We'll move on to the next talk since we're a little behind. The next speaker is Dr. Rohit Shetty, and he's going to give us a glimpse into all the new things that are helping us make our diagnosis and selection of patients correct in refractive surgery. So he's going to talk on new diagnostic modalities in refractive surgery. Welcome, Dr. Rohit.
Hello, friends. Thank you for this opportunity to share my presentation today. I'm going to speak on new diagnostic modalities in refractive surgery. I know financial interests in this directly connected with this talk, but these are my financial interests regarding the companies I work with. The refractive surgery practice, diagnostics started with the Placido-based topographers, and we have moved a lot from the Pentacam, the OpScan, all the new modalities of looking at the biomechanics, and now a hybrid system which looks at both the combination of topography and the biomechanics. I'll divide my talk into these components: the epithelium nerves, the topography biomechanics, predictive modeling, the collagen imaging, and then looking at the future of kids. This is a patient who comes to us with inferior stapling. And you can see that the CBI and TBI represents the biomechanical parameters, and this is from the Pentacam, and the PAT-D is your topography parameters, which is on a suspicious side. But when you look at it, the whole of that area is actually an epithelial hypertrophy. The question is, what is really happening here? And that area is a huge mix of some inflammation there, a localized inflammation, which you call it as the dendritic cells. So the imaging now is just not single mode. We had to look at multiple different model of imaging to understand or get the right picture. This is a corneal epithelial maps of a patient who has a healthy meibomian glands, and this is about a patient who has an unhealthy meibomian glands, and you can see the epithelial hyperplasia out here. And this has a normal nerves, and this has these microneuromas. These dendritic cells are represented out here. These are all cells which are kind of inflammatory in nature. And just a small preview into what is really happening to the whole cornea surface as a whole when you see this picture on ocular surface, when the patient has an ocular surface issues. Imagine you do a surgery on them. You would probably end up in increased epithelial hyperplasia because this is already in poor glands, and this is a normal one. a normal wound healing. And here, look at the wound healing. There's no nerves. And this is important, all these fragile nerves. Compared to here, the nerves are very healthy. And that actually gets into your poor tear film optics. And you can see the scatter here, and you can see there's no scatter here. So it also has a huge impact in your quality of your vision, quality of healing, and quality of how the epithelium heals. The second question we always ask when you see a doubtful case is, should we just do a surgery or we should just defer it? And that's where the whole concept about combining topography and biomechanics came into the picture. So I divided them into 4 groups. The group 1 is your biomechanics is normal, your topography is normal, your biomechanics plus the tomography is also normal. The CBI stands more for just more of a corneal biomechanics. The band is your pentacam, and TBI stands both of a combination of both. The second group is when the biomechanics is normal, the topography is abnormal, and the biomechanics plus the topography is normal. So you have the topography only normal. So basically you have the topo is normal, topo is abnormal, sorry, and the biomechanics is normal. So that means you are structurally, it's showing as abnormality, the biomechanically it's showing as normal. So probably a SMILE or PRK extra would do a benefit here. It's a different debate about whether SMILE extra works or not, or whether extra works or not. But according to me, if you really look at selecting your cases, then you have a good chance it will work. The group 3 is your biomechanics is abnormal, the topography is abnormal, and the topography plus biomechanics is also abnormal. So that means structurally it is showing it as normal. That means your topography is just borderline, abnormal or borderline. The biomechanics is abnormal. Again, if it's less than 6 diopter, consider a SMILE extra or a PRK. And if it's more, then look at an phakic lenses or ICL, because it's completely a biomechanically abnormal eye. The group 4 is structurally abnormal and biomechanically abnormal. Just consider a phakic lenses. So basically what I'm trying to say is you get different ways of looking at how you plan with your corneal surgery, refractive surgery. How do you go further? We have multiple different scans. Sometimes we get confused about what do we do. You can see all this group 1s, group 2s, and what I just said. Sometimes everybody is normal. Sometimes one is abnormal. Sometimes one is abnormal, the other 2 are normal. So you have multiple permutation and combination out here. So what do we do with this? So which refractive surgery to choose? Let's go back to a little bit into our, physical sense, means from our physics and mathematics domain. So most of the accident simulation or the flight simulation is done with finite element modeling. You have a modeling which tells you if you put this much of pressure of air, what happens? If you have an accident, how much is your damage and what happens? So everything is created with the simulation. So we decided whether we could bring a simulation platform, an AI-based platform, into a practice. So that is what we developed this as a software. It's the world's first software. I'm very proud to share with you here of this kind, and this will be incorporated into a lot of machines. You take the Pentacam, you create a mesh. You need a mesh because it's just like how you have this. You have the mesh, everything is a mesh here. And each mesh works on a principle of how you induce certain amount of force. And then you get the Corvus data. And then you create a cornea based on the mesh and based on wavefront optimized ablation pattern. And then you look at what would be is your prediction of post-operative stiffness. And this is what we published. The one is in the dotted lines is a simulation. One with the strong lines is your real surgeries. And you can see that all of them predicted exactly the same way as you see during a post-op period. So basically what you're trying to do is you're combining these 2 mechanisms, adding the FEM to it, and then making a prediction. And this is what is very important in our practice. And this is what we made it into a software, and this is a software which is available. You can run the scans, you can add all the data, you can use any procedure you want, and you'll get that, okay, if you're using a PRK, this is what you belong to. And it uses a spring model. That's why your newtons per meter is what you value getting, because this is newtons per meter. Because pre-op is 74, predicted post-op, it becomes 68, and what is weak is 6. So that means that's how much it gives you. And any time outside this zone, it means that it is risk for ectasia. So this is what it says. And you can see that this is the picture. And this is a picture where you're looking at this kind of a topography here. And this is your refraction. Then I can run this into LASIK, SMILE, or PRK. So if I'm doing a LASIK, this is your pre-op. All of them are the same, 84 newtons per meter. All of them are same. But when you look at the post-op, it is 75 here, 70, maybe around 73, and it's 77 on a PRK. So here you can see that post-operatively, this is still stiffer because you can see the amount of reduction is 9, 8, and 7. So here the LASIK would induce 9 meters per square weakness. The SMILE would induce 8.9, and the PRK would induce around 7.7. So what I'm saying is PRK in this case is the strongest. So that is how you decide on your practice. And it's again the same thing. You can see here is 62 and it's 62, both are the same. And the induction predicted change in the stiffness, that is how weak it's becoming, 20, and here is 19, and here it's 18. So which one is the strongest here? Again, the PRK would be the strongest in this case. Sometimes we see the SMILE as the strongest. We are also using mechanism to use the SMILE extra also. Virtually, it's been used in China, Australia, a lot of some of the European countries. We're trying to get into United States also into this, and many places in India. So this is going to be one of the most useful thing in predicting the process. Coming to imaging the collagen, we built this polarization sensitivity, which looks at the way the collagen orientation are, the fibrils are. You can see that each collagen is, in this case, there's a partial loss. Darker blues are normal. And you can see that it's only dark blue here. Everything is light blue. It's complete loss of collagen. And this coincides well with your biomechanics also. So this you can see that, and in future, you can use this to see whether you want to do a LASIK procedure or a phakic lenses. This is a patient who underwent SMILE 9 months back. And you can, this is his refractive error. His complaints of glare and halos at night. And of course, you can see that there is a small amount of decentration here. There's some epithelial thickness out here. And you can see that this area is also small decentered. You can see this is a decentered one. We thought we wanted to do a LASIK correction on him, tophoguided treatment. But what we are surprised to see is we are shocked to see the collagen, which is very poor. Look at the normal, and this is, and see that there's hardly any collagen here. So we were wondering whether this is actually a post-LASIK ectasia, post-SMILE ectasia in evolution. It's extremely important to pick up if this is actually a post-LASIK ectasia. The future is, COVID has taught us about the power of diagnostics. We have published this work on inflammation. We're looking at building a kit which looks at looking at all these factors. These kits will, ELISA-based kit is going to pick up a lot of things, including the lysolol space, which is important to hold the collagen. And based on what we find, we can look at different treatment options for these patients. Finally, the gene therapy is coming into our clinics. We are also looking at a gene therapy model for collagen or keratoconus or post-LASIK ectasia by using the lysyl oxidase model. We've been working on the mouse models, and you can see some mouses here and using some imaging techniques to see when we inject these drops, how it works. Is something which is very exciting and probably needs a different chart, different presentation for that. Finally, epithelium nerves, stromal biomechanics, imaging the collagen, advanced diagnostics, all that really helps in the future of understanding refractive surgery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit. This was wonderful. I guess that Rohit had to catch a flight, so he will not be there for discussion. So I'm sure this has given us a lot of food for thought, and it was really a cutting edge talk. And I'm very happy that Rohit is from one amongst us, and he's really putting all of us and giving us the proud moment that he's doing such great work. So without wasting much time, I would now like to go to the next talk, and I would want to invite Dr. Gaurav Luthra for giving his talk. Gaurav, what are you doing new in refractive surgery?
I think nothing that you are not doing. So I'll just try to, leave a few pearls that, I've been working with. Let me share my screen, and thanks for inviting me to this prestigious session where all the topmost people are there. So I'm grateful for TOS to have invited me. And so I thought, I would share these things. And I know that all of my, colleagues here are already doing all this. So it's nothing new for them actually. And most refractive surgeons would probably be actually doing many of these things, which I find useful in the last year or two that I've, kind of been improvising on. But I think in refractive surgery, we continue to learn all the time. So it's always a great, feeling to know that, you're always learning new things, and it's very exciting. So I think when it comes to diagnostics, so Rohit has already told and about how we've evolved, but I was just looking back, and when we started off doing LASIK somewhere in 2001 or 2, we started with just a corneal topographer and an ultrasonic pachymeter, and that's all we had to go with. And I was amazed by how long, what a long way we've come, because gradually, we started adding devices, and there is no end to it. And today I still have a shopping list of a couple of devices. So we added a wavefront abrometer in 2003. And I think the Pentacam, which for me is one of the most important devices in my practice, without which I will probably not even do a refractive surgery. And as it has gone on, we also started using the optical biometer. It really helps in documenting patients' axial lens accurately, and also gives you a lot of other data. So it adds to the data given by many of the other devices. And then we added the Vario Topolizer when we got the EX500 way back in 2013. Then we started using this for our topo-guided treatments even before we started doing Contura Vision. We actually use the Virion now for cyclotorsion measurements, and in our SMILE cases, we have been using the Virion to check for those people who have more cyclotorsion than others. It's been an evolving indication. Then the epithelium mapping, which came about. So I think our diagnostics have grown in such a big way. We added a tear film analyzer. Now we routinely do this for all our patients as well. So I think, our LASIK patients today, refractive surgery patients, actually go through all these things. And, it's so difficult because you can't charge them for this. So you end up charging them a flat, small fee and doing so many tests for them. Then the eye trace. So the list is endless, and now we are thinking whether we should do the Corvis, as Rohit was talking about. So all these things have really made life good and difficult both for the refractive surgeon. But with so much data available, it makes life much easier, that you can take a good decision and decide for the patient, as Dr. Rupal said, choosing the right procedure and saying no when you have to say no to a patient, or keeping them on watch. And many of these patients who were put on watch few years back, today we can operate them with newer techniques. So I think one technique, one diagnostic device, which I really have enjoyed using in the last few years, it is the OCT-based epithelium thickness mapping. And we use the Avanti RT View, which is very good. And there are other devices which are good as well. So it does help us. This is obviously an advanced keratoconus patient where you can see that there is apical thinning of the epithelium. But in subtle cases where there is very minimal, suspicion of keratoconus, or the cornea is not looking great on topography or Pentacam, this becomes a very, very useful device, because it does help you pick up those subtle cases. And also for all our refractive surgery patients, to pre-operatively, they all go through this, and we also monitor them post-op with the epithelium mapping for our surface patients, for our SMILE patients. And many of these patients, if they have a post-operative surprise of some kind, it's very often the epithelium which is to blame, and then you can always manage them better if you know what is happening. And the stromal mapping, and then also the corneal warpage, which you can pick up using the OCT for the epithelium mapping. I borrowed this slide from Rishi. He was kind enough, because I didn't have a corneal warpage case, but you can differentiate a keratoconus or a suspect cornea from contact lens warpage. The second device, which I really think has added a lot to our understanding, is the eye trace, which of course is an abrometer and a topographer combined. And yes, I think most of us who use it do enjoy using it quite a bit. It took me a couple of years to decide to buy it, but ever since we got it, it's been really good. It has several applications from refractive to cataract surgery to toric IOL planning. So it does give us a lot of information, and I'll showcase one small case to you just now. And so this particular thing called the dysfunctional lens index, which I think Rohit also uses a lot and many of our other colleagues use, tells you a lot about the internal optics of the eye. And if somebody has a poor, internal aberration profile, they will not be great candidates for any active surgery, and you may have to think about a lens-based procedure. And so let's go to this case that I wanted to share with you. This is a 25-year-old girl who was presented to us with the right eye minus 20.5 and a 3.5 cylinder at 20. The thing was that she was not improving to beyond 636 in the right eye with the best correction. Obviously, anisometropia, the left eye is only 5.5, improving to about 6.9. So we had to decide what the kind of procedure we might want to offer her. She was very uncomfortable with her vision. Her topography maps looked fairly good, but the corneal thickness was very bad, 430 and 426. So obviously no possibility of doing a laser-based procedure. Yet she had had a stable refraction for the last couple of years, and she was looking for a solution and not doing well at all. So we went through the gamut of investigations. We found that the epithelium was good. Now, when it comes to the eye trace, and if you look here, this is for the left eye. The left eye shows a dysfunctional lens index, which is perfect, which means 10. So the internal optics are perfect. Look at what happens to the right eye. It's way down there, it's just 1.21. So when your lens index is so bad, this eye is not going to do with any kind of refractive procedure except to do a lens exchange. So we went ahead with the refractive lens exchange for the right eye. These are the eye trace maps, and you can see how it looks. These are the internal, and you can see the internal aberrations are phenomenal for the right eye. So we went ahead and planned a refractive lens exchange. And now watch what happens. Post-op, the patient actually improves to about 6.9 parts. And look at the dysfunctional lens index, because obviously the cataract is gone and now there's a pseudophakic there. It gives you a clear 10. And this patient actually improved drastically. There was some astigmatism, and we could not put on a toric lens because the power was too low, but we did decrease the astigmatism with femto LRIs. But this patient eventually did extremely well. The fellow eye was treated with an ICL because the corneal thickness was very small. Very happy patient and did very well with both eyes. So, so you can choose procedures, and there are so many times when we actually choose one procedure for one eye and another one for the other eye. Now, this was another patient. So I thought I'll go through 3-4 cases which will help highlight what we are doing today. And this was another patient with a right eye 2.75 and left eye 1.5 with some astigmatism, worked up for refractive surgery. Left eye showed some inferior steepening. It was not a very bad situation, but we monitored her for about a year, and this kind of topography map persisted. And while everything else was good, the bad displays were good. But this, this yellow flag was there, and we were wondering what to do with this patient. And whenever in doubt, I think you shift to the surface, and that's what we did. So we decided to plan this patient for a surface ablation. And I think Dr. Rupal has already explained about PRK. So what holds us back is probably the pain and discomfort. And here is where, we have started using last 3 years, ketorolac soap BCL, which shows research was done by Rohit Shetty's group in Narayan Mitrale. And that's where I learned about this, started using it regularly. And subsequently, we've been using it for last 3 years very effectively. And we have now been using Acusade, which is from NTOD, and I have no financial interest, but we did the trials for this drug. It works as well as AccuVeil, which is no longer available. Since we are going to be short of time, I'll go through this. So basically, you soak the contact lens for about 10 minutes in this ketorolac solution before you use it following surface ablation. And yes, I do a lot of surface ablation, especially now because our pain control is excellent, and I use mitomycin. I think Dr. Jagdish is going to talk a lot about this, so I'm not going to skip this. And we do a lot of trans-PRK now. So this has become one of my preferred. I had a lot of reservations about this when I started doing it, but it has come out really good. So having proper mapping is extremely important. And this is a plan where you can actually feed in the data of the epithelium thickness. So basically the laser will first ablate a plano profile epithelium, and no nomograms are required, unlike the PTK modes which were there in the old machines. So now we can use trans-PRK to get more effective outcomes. These are the two eyes, and the laser will ablate 1 millimeter bigger than the optical zone. And in one shot, it can complete the treatments. And I will skip this video for lack of brevity of time. But the patients are very, very happy. And you can see that some of these patients actually don't even look like they underwent a surgery on day 1 post-op. And they can actually read 6/6 unaided on day 1. And you can't make out if you did a surface ablation on day 1. So they're pretty clear. This is day 1 post-op. Previous evening she was operated. So they do extremely well. Our post-op regime is like this. Topical FML is started on the table and goes on for about 6 to 8 weeks, and UV protection. These are the 2 key things. So Streamlight has been good for us, and I think on the Schwind also it's available in a very, very good system as well. Both these lasers are doing extremely well. Coming on to Contura planning, I think what we've done is Contura has come in a big way in the last few years. It's been advertised a lot, but frankly, I enjoy using it for select patients where I feel that it does a lot of good work. And Contura is basically a topo-guided treatment, as all of us will probably know. And it was FDA approved for virgin eyes, but we now use it for our CXL, combined CXL patients and some of our other treatments as well. And off late, what is new is that we have started using the Forsities. So this is one patient where we use the Forsities planning station. This was a -7.5 and a -7 with some astigmatism of 1.5 and 2 diopters. And here we had a good, healthy looking cornea there. And the eye trace profiles were good. So this was the Forsities planning station. This is a software designed by Mark Lobanov, which gives us excellent help with the Contura planning. So you can feed in the manifest refraction, and it picks up the Contura refractions from the laser itself. And then you can feed in the anterior and posterior corneal details. It gives you this recommended treatment plan here. So it actually tells you whether to go ahead with a Contura plan or not. And then it tells you the exact way to plan it. For example, the manifest was 170. The Contura was recommending a treatment at 4 degrees. It is now telling you to treat at 5 degrees. It has also made some small changes. Now, initially, again, we were very, very unsure about how to use this, but as time has gone over about a year that we've been using it, it has shown excellent results, and it has totally changed our understanding of Contura treatments. I cannot go into the details because I only wanted to introduce you to this concept of how the Forsities stations can do the vector planning, and it's a very, very easy thing to use once you understand how to use it. So these are the 2 eyes that were treated, and both eyes did extremely well. They were both almost plano post-op. So this is on the planning station for the Contura. I think this requires a full lecture of itself for 30 minutes to speak. So our results have been transformed with Contura treatments, and also it tells you when to switch to the Wavefront optimized protocols. But I think the most important thing is to get quality data, which is the key to getting success with Contura treatments. And indications for Contura, every patient is not to be sold Contura. I think that's very important. And my last patient, this is -7 with 1.75 at 40 degrees in the right eye, and -6.75 with 1. I think I'm going to run short of time, so maybe I should kind of summarize. So this patient was taken up for, in the right eye, we had a suspect cornea, and patient was keen to get a SMILE procedure. After doing a lot of evaluation, we realized that we could proceed with SMILE. The corneal thickness was good and the other maps were good. And we did see a small thing on the anterior bad display maps as well. And on the left eye, there was almost a pristine map. So we went ahead with a SMILE extra in the right eye. And SMILE extra works very well when you have a slightly suspect cornea, if you want to kind of ensure that you're not going to take any risks for the patient. And in the left eye, we went with a SMILE. The epithelial maps were pretty good as well. And both eyes were treated. And this was the protocol used for the cross-linking. It's a flash treatment. And using the LASIK L dye, which works well for these eyes, we did a 30 milliwatts for 1.5 minutes. So these patients do well, and we do switch to SMILE extra whenever we have a slightly suspect cornea. And I think smiling with Dr. Rupal has already talked about this, so I'll skip this. But today we actually, do a lenticule delivery. Dr. Rupal, I think, has seen this already before. But after the flap dissection, I don't like to use the forceps to deliver the lenticule. I do a hydro explantation of the lenticule. So you just push a gush of fluid once you've done that, and the lenticule pops out. It's very elegant. It's very safe. And these lenticules can be brought out much more easily and more predictably like this. But yes, you have to use all the different techniques, and people who are experienced surgeons can just pull out the lenticule with just their manipulator itself. So our practice has grown with SMILE, with 60% cases are now SMILE, and LASIK is almost out, except for those small few indications like hyperopia and some very high astigmatism where we do Contura. So I think I'll finish off with this. I'll not go into my ICL case at all, because I think we've run short of time. So to summarize, refractive surgery has come a long way since we started almost 30 years back. And a gamut of diagnostic devices gives us a lot more information than we ever had. And our understanding of the finer points in refractive surgery has grown tremendously in the last 25, 30 years, which has helped us do better case selections. And a choice of procedures is now available, allowing excellent visual results and safety. So each patient is different and should receive customized advice and customized treatments, not in the sense that customization, but choose the right procedure for the right patient, and then they do well. So it's very exciting times for refractive surgeons. And with that, I would like to stop.
Thank you, Dr. Gaurav. This was extensive and really, really useful. It's really amazing that, and deriving from all the experiences of so many years that you've really given us pearls of wisdom. Thank you. Only thing I hope that we've not really scared everybody off, thinking that you require a number of instruments and the latest technology only to do a good job. I think we should all be also aware that you could do, even with the simplest of procedures, a good job. That's what we have also been able to do years back. But when you have more information, it makes you a little more safer surgeon for you, and choosing the correct patients, and also to say no to the correct people. So that just teaches you that. So with that, I think we should go on to the next talk. Are there any questions for Dr. Gaurav?
And we'll take questions in the end because we are running.
Yes.
Yes.
Should we invite Dr. Jagdish Reddy now? He's coming up with the 2.0 surface ablation. Dr. Jagdish, please share your experience. I like the title, Surface Ablation 2.0.
Thank you, Dr. Shah, and hopefully you can see my slides here.
Yes, sir. No, we can see you.
Okay.
We can't see the slides yet, Jagdish.
See your slide
Sorry
earlier.
about
Yeah, now it's visible.
Yes, now it's visible.
Okay, sorry about that. And at the outset, I would like to thank Rishi and the Dr. Santosh Hanover and the TOS Scientific Committee for having me today. So you've heard a lot about PRK more than any other procedure in the previous talks from Rohit and Gaurav and also Dr. Shah. So I'll take you through PRK procedure, how it is safe in very high myopia. So it's titled as Surface Ablation 2. Thank you for the title, Rishi, and PRK for high myopia. So here in this talk, we'll be talking about why we prefer a PRK, patient and surgeon perspectives of the procedure, how does it compare with other procedures, and I would also like to share the data from LV Prasad Eye Institute. So we have a clear, as Dr. Shah has mentioned in her talk, that we have clear distinctions of range of correction that we can do for different procedures, but we do have variability in the extremes, wherein different surgeons practice with different amount of corrections, and there's no standardization here, and we do have very little amount of literature available at these extremes. Let's look at how PRK trades over LASIK in several factors like case selection. So if you look at, according to the patients, it's an old procedure and it is considered to be an inferior procedure because of the slow visual recovery. And according to the surgeon, it's a first few days troubles that you'll have to receive all the calls from the patients because of the contact lens. They may have discomfort, and the limits of correction is always variable. Like a lot of surgeons don't prefer operating on high corrections because of risk of haze and refractive predictability and stability. And also a lot of surgeons are apprehensive about use of mitomycin C. So, but it's good to see that there is literature comparing the patient's satisfaction levels after PRK compared to LASIK. And I don't think the patients are really unhappy with the PRK procedure. On overall, these studies have shown that the satisfaction levels have been pretty good with PRK as well. And as Rohit talked about a lot about role of biomechanics and topography in selecting a patient for keratorefractive surgery, here is a study from Damien and his group from Paris. They've shown that even in slightly unusual corneas where you have asymmetric bow tie, PRK is a very good procedure. And in their CDs over a period of 5 years, they did not see any ectasia in the patients that they have operated using surface ablation method. And these are the topographies from their CDs. So you can see here a lot of these, all these patients have irregular topographies, and they do have elevations, unusual elevations and thinner pachymetries, but none of them developed ectasia. And if you look at the entire literature, there's just a few cases of ectasia that have been reported over the years, and they do have some unusual preoperative parameters like being a thin cornea or very young age or very high corrections. And one of the concern when we do a higher corrections on the cornea is cornea getting very flat, and then you end up having a poor quality of vision. So this is one of the study that has looked at correction on with using very high amount of corrections and the cornea going to as low as less than 35 diopters. And this study, they did show that the quality of vision in these patients was not poor, and patient did enjoy good vision both in the quantity and quality wise after PRK procedure. And Rohit has talked a lot about corneal biomechanics. Here we do know that after PRK, the corneal biomechanics at least altered compared to femtosecond, any LASIK procedure or the SMILE procedures. In a nutshell, if you look at the Cochrane review, so visual recovery is definitely faster following LASIK than PRK. Final uncorrected visual acuity following LASIK and PRK is comparable, and the accuracy that is achieved between the two procedures is comparable over a period of time. So let's look at what our data says. So we looked at patients over 2013 to 2019. We had about 10,176 eyes of 5,196 patients over the years. On the right, you can see distribution over the years. And this is the preoperative characteristic features of the patients that is shown here. Okay, so we do the technique slightly different to what has been described earlier. So here we use topical anesthetic, that's the proparacaine, to remove the epithelium. The paracaine is a epithelial toxic medication. So we just put a few drops of paracaine on the surface and leave it for 30 seconds. And then using a spatula, we remove the epithelium. So, and then we do the necessary ablation on the anterior surface of the cornea. This is followed by application of mitomycin C. We use 0.02% of mitomycin C at for a duration of 10 seconds per diopter of refractive error that we are correcting. So, and then I prefer placing a drop rather than a sponge, because the drop I can spread it out, because the cornea is more curved, putting a sponge which doesn't touch in the peripheries. And hence I prefer putting a drop, and then a thorough wash is done with balanced salt solution, and then a bandage contact lens is placed. And over the years, we did see a lot of loss to follow-up. Here I'll be describing about follow-ups at 3 months in these patients. We'll be looking at how patients did with age, gender, laterality, magnitude of correction, and astigmatism. So we will be looking at uncorrected visual acuity achieved, corrected distance visual acuity achieved, spherical equivalent postoperatively, and corneal haze seen postoperatively. So if you look at the outcomes, like we've divided patients into different age categories. If you see here, the uncorrected visual acuity increases by a certain factor of logMAR visual acuity with increasing age category. A similar trend is seen even with corrected distance visual acuity. But here, if you see the spherical equivalent and haze that was achieved post-operatively was comparable different age, among the different age groups. And all the parameter studies were comparable between the two genders. And similar pattern was seen even with laterality. With the right eye and left eye, we could see the similar results post-operatively. Depending on the amount of correction that we did, we divided the patients into 4 categories. So less than 3 diopters of spherical equivalent, 3 to 6 diopters of spherical equivalent, and 6.1 to 9 diopters of spherical equivalent, and greater than 9 diopters. If you look at the uncorrected visual acuity by univariate analysis, UCVA increases by a certain factor with increasing refractive error. That is that UCVA and CDVA both worsen by a certain factor with increasing amount of correction. But the amount of spherical equivalent achieved postoperatively was not different among these groups. That was good to see. And as we know that with higher corrections, there is going to be increased amount of haze that is seen. And we did see that there's a certain factor that the factor is also very less, 0.10, with which the haze risk of haze increased with each group of correction. And when we divided this patient into different categories based on the different spherical equivalent, and this is the preoperative characteristic features among the groups. And we did look at a few parameters post-operatively. So we looked at the efficacy, safety, accuracy, and stability. So if you look at the efficacy of the procedure for different refractive error categories, it was pretty efficacious among all the categories, and most of the patients achieved 20/20 vision compared to what they had pre-operatively. So if you look at all, this is on the top left, you see 0 to 3 diopters. On the top right, you see 3.1 to 6 diopters. On the bottom left, you see 6.1 diopter to 9 diopters. On the bottom right, you see greater than 9 diopters. And looking at safety, so if you look at among all the categories, the safety was pretty high in low refractive errors. 96% of the patients had pretty much same or better visual acuity, corrected distance visual acuity post-surgery at 3 months. And this was 93% in 3 to 6 diopter group. And it was a 6 to 9, in the 6 to 9 diopters, it was about 90%. And it was about 85% in greater than 9 diopters of correction. But here it's also important to notice there's a higher number of lines lost as the amount of correction increased in these patients. And we look at the accuracy as well. So here majority of the patients achieved within plus or minus 0.5 diopters. And if you look at, this was very high in low errors, about 97%, whereas it is about 89% in patients greater than 9 diopters. And if you look at the stability of this error, it was pretty stable in all the groups, irrespective of amount of correction that we did. But we did see some amount of regression over a period of time in patients who had higher amount of corrections. And it gradually increased from 1% to 1 to 4% from low refractive errors to 10 to 20% with high refractive errors. And when we compared our results with the results that are published, so with these platforms that we use over the years, I think our results were comparable or slightly better in all aspects that were looked at. And when we look at the higher corrections with LASIK, and our results were that is achieved with PRK was comparable with the refractive error achieved post-operatively. The uncorrected visual acuity achieved post-operatively with both high myopia and very high myopia after LASIK procedure as well. So the number of lines lost as well was comparable. And for very high myopes, we know that will incline more towards phakic IOLs. And there's a study that is looked at comparing phakic IOLs and PRK for very high myopes. And this study definitely did show that the results were comparable both with uncorrected visual acuity and the refractive error that was achieved post-operatively as well. So I'm coming to astigmatism management. So we divided the patients into 4 categories, and we did see that both uncorrected and distant visual acuity and corrected distance visual acuity increases by a certain factor with increasing cylinder. And this trend was also seen with spherical equivalent. And we did see increased amount of haze as amount of astigmatism increases. And haze was seen on all the groups, and majority of the patients had mild haze, and this was higher in patients who had higher amount of correction compared to those who had lower amount of correction. So though we did see a mild amount of haze requiring surgical intervention was very less. And this is one of the patients where the haze was significant and required a PTK. And the bottom, you see patients of the PTK doing very good with a clear cornea and minimal amount of refractive error post-surgery. And we do look, because we use a different protocol for correction of refractive error, we did look at if it has look at the safety of it. So we looked at the endothelial cell count with the same protocol that we use. The endothelial cell count, it was not statistically significant before and post-surgery. And we did not find a correlation between MMC duration and change in endothelial cell density, and the residual stromal bed thickness and the change in endothelial cell density as well. So in a nutshell, after surface ablation, there's slightly longer recovery for very high myopes. The magnitude of spherical equivalent has an effect on uncorrected and corrected distance visual acuity.
Dr. Jagdish, so sorry to interrupt you. May I please request you to please sum up in next 30 seconds since we are running short of time, sir.
Yes, I'm really sorry about that. This is the last slide.
Sure.
So magnitude of spherical equivalent has an effect on uncorrected and best corrected visual acuities, spherical equivalent and haze that is seen post-operatively. And definitely long-term stability is seen in surface ablation as well as compared to LASIK and phakic IOLs. So definitely PRK could be an option in patients who have slightly compromised topography, steep or flat keratometry, high percentage tissue alterations that you end up doing after surface, after any keratorefractive surgery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jagdish. Very comprehensive and insightful talk. Since we are running short of time, we may not be able to pick up the questions. So sorry for that.
No problem. And thank you so much. And it was wonderful to be part of this session.
Wonderful. So amazing presentation by all our speakers and fantastically moderated by Dr. Rishi and Dr. Rupal. Thank you, Dr. Rupal, for chairing the session. With this, we conclude this session.